talk about memory, which is the retention of information or experience over time. Memory is one of the topics that is studied by cognitive psychologists. And cognitive psychologists really love to use a computer model for most of their different theories. For instance, in the case of memory, you can think of memory as having both hardware and software, much like a computer has hardware like a mouse or a monitor, and software such as a word processor or a program to manage photos or something like that. In the case of memory, your hardware is what we think of as memory structures. Those are the structures in your memory that hold information or experiences. They don't necessarily correspond one-to-one to any particular literal structure, although there's multiple brain areas involved, such as we saw in the chapter on biology. Your hippocampus is very important in memory. But these are sort of theoretical structures that contain different types of memory. The software of your memory system are the processes. The processes are ways of getting information into your memory and calling it to mind later when you need the information. So this diagram over here on the right shows the three memory systems: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. They're named based on essentially how long they last. So sensory memory is a very brief image or echo that is stored in your mind temporarily. Short-term memory has a relatively short life. It's about 30 seconds, and it has a small capacity. We'll see that it's 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. And then long-term memory is most of what you've learned over your lifetime. It's unlimited. You could store as much knowledge as you're able to acquire in your entire life. So these three blue structures are the hardware of the memory system, and the pink arrows represent some of the processes or the software of the system. They get information in and out of your memory system. So sensory input enters your sensory memory. It gets transferred into short-term memory. To keep it there, you rehearse it. If you do not rehearse the information, you will forget it. And if you want to keep this information for your lifetime, it has to be transferred into your long-term memory. And then you need to be able to retrieve it when you need the information, like on a test. Anything that is lost from these different types of memory involves some form of forgetting. So we'll look at the memory processes a little bit more in a moment. The processes fall into three categories. Encoding means taking information and putting it into memory. And you could do that with a visual code, imagining what it looks like, with a semantic code, which is sort of the meaning of the information, or acoustic, what it sounds like. Of course, anytime you're learning something, there's an advantage to using more than one code. There's some cases in which you may have an encoding failure. So the reason you can't remember something is not that you cannot retrieve it from your memory, but rather the fact that it never got into your memory. Like for instance, if I asked you on the American flag, what color is the very last stripe on the flag? You have a 50-50 chance of getting it right. But are you giving the answer based on a guess, or do you really know? Many people have never encoded that information. Storage is keeping information in your memory, and retrieval is recovering it from memory when you need it later. So there's several different ways that you can retrieve information from memory. The easiest way is relearning. Like in high school, I took math through Algebra 2, and then I took a year off from taking math, and then when I got to college, I had to retake algebra, and it was a whole lot easier the second time I took it. Recognition memory is a little bit more difficult. It's the kind of memory that you use when you take a multiple choice test. All of the answers are there. Your job is to recognize the correct one. That's a little bit easier than recall. Free recall means that with very little prompting, the answer isn't there. You have to come up with it on your own. So that would be a fill in the blank or possibly an essay style test. So the basic memory processes get information into our sensory memory, and then there's various things that can cause information to decay or to be forgotten from each of these different types of memory. So we're going to be looking in a little bit more detail at these three types of memory. And in particular, we'll spend a little bit more time on long-term memory, which is very critical for learning. So we'll start by talking about sensory and short-term memory. Sensory memory is a relatively brief register of information. It lasts either a quarter of a second for visual sensations. These are called iconic memories. Just like on your computer, you have icons that are visual symbols that let you know if you click here, you open a Word program, or you open up PowerPoint or Facebook or something like that. Visual memories, they last a quarter of a second. If you've ever played with sparklers on the 4th of July and you've drawn your name up in the air in lights with the sparkler, what you're seeing, because light exists at one point in space and time, so it's really not possible for you to have your name up there in lights. What you're actually seeing is where the light is now, plus your memory of the light up to a quarter of a second ago. So if you have a very short name, like my name, Carrie, C-A-R-I, you could see your whole name in lights very briefly. But if you have a very long name with 10 or more letters, or multiple names, hyphenated, then you're not going to be able to see the beginning of the name and the end of the name at the same time, because by the time you get to the end of your name, the information from the beginning of your name has already faded. Now, echoic memory, this is information just like echoes, it's auditory, and it lasts about 2 seconds. If you've ever had somebody talk to you and then they say, I asked you, what do you want to eat? And you realize that you hadn't been listening to them, but you could go back in time 2 seconds and grab the last thing you heard, which was eat. And then you could say something like, oh, I was hoping we could get Mexican food. Because you didn't really hear or listen to what they were saying. It got into your echoic memory, and you could go back and grab it so that you could kind of get out of letting the person know that you hadn't really been listening. So your visual or auditory sensory memories get into your brain as long as you're paying attention to them, but they very briefly fade. Working memory or short-term memory, they're two names for the same thing. It's sometimes called working memory. I see that the short-term memory, it's up here, but it was in blue, which doesn't do well against the blue background. But these are two names for basically the same thing. Sometimes we call it working memory because it's the memories you're currently working on. And that's memory that you hold in your head for about 30 seconds. If you're not rehearsing it. If you quit rehearsing the information, it'll be lost within 30 seconds. So as an example, it's not something that most of us have to worry about today. I don't know some of the most important people in my life's phone number because my phone remembers their phone number, so I don't have to. But back when I was growing up, we didn't have cell phones. We only had landlines, and you had to dial people's numbers to get them. So you would have your head filled with all kinds of numbers that were in long-term memory for the people that you knew well. But every once in a while, you would need a phone number temporarily. Like if your friend said, let's order a pizza. Okay, what's the phone number for the pizza place? And say they said 714-628-4833. You had to remember that just long enough to pick up the phone and dial those numbers. And if somebody asked you a question like, hey, do you like pineapple on your pizza? It might be so distracting that you ask them to please repeat the number because you have forgotten it. So in order to keep that information in your short-term memory, you have to do what's called maintenance rehearsal. That's purposely repeating the information over and over to yourself. And as soon as something else takes your attention away, then it could displace that information from short-term memory. Sort of the way if you imagine having a bookshelf that's open at both ends, and you have the entire space of that shelf filled with books, and you want to put a new book on top of that shelf, something has to come out for the new book to go in. So that's what we mean by displacement. So how much information can you get into your working memory or short-term memory? It's 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. And a chunk is an easily identifiable unit of information. So imagine that I asked you to memorize a 10-digit number, like the pizza place. And this isn't really the pizza place, it's actually my office phone number at SCC. But let's say I asked you to please remember 714628483. It's very difficult to memorize something with 10 digits because we can only remember 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. That's another way of saying 5 to 9. 10 is outside the range of what is easy for humans to remember. However, if you chunk the information, that is, it starts with 714. You think of that as one chunk. Then the next chunk is that 3-digit prefix, 628. And everything at SCC starts with 628. So the first 2 chunks of information are pretty easy. You just have to memorize the last 4 digits in order to chunk that information. So your social security number is probably remembered very similarly. If you had to report it out loud to somebody, you would probably say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It would come out in those 3 chunks. You also learned the 26-letter alphabet by chunking. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. So you memorized all that because you've chunked the information. If I asked you to say the alphabet backwards, you would have a great deal of difficulty in comparison to saying it the regular way. So that's our short-term or working memory. If we want to keep stuff around for longer than that, we have to talk about long-term memory. I want to point out again that maintenance rehearsal, saying something over and over to yourself, keeps information in short-term memory. It's not a good way to try to remember information over the long run. So if your method of studying is to just keep repeating information over and over again, you're not using the best strategies for studying. So what about long-term memory? This is a relatively permanent memory system. It has a virtually unlimited capacity. So if humans could live for 200 years and you could get a law degree and then go back to school and get a medical degree and then go back to school and get a PhD, you could keep all of that information in your long-term memory. And they basically last forever, assuming that there is no brain damage and nothing like Alzheimer's or something that causes any kind of actual memory loss. If you want to get information into your long-term memory and make it easily accessible, you need to be aware of this concept, levels of processing, and specifically the concept of elaborative rehearsal. So we already talked about maintenance rehearsal, saying things over to yourself to keep it in short-term memory. But to get information into long-term memory, you need deep processing. That is, there are different depths to how much you can process information, from very shallow down to deep levels of processing. And the more deeply you process information, the better it will be remembered. When you purposely use deep processing techniques, then you're using elaborative rehearsal to increase the retention of new information, and doing so by relating it to stuff that you already know. So what do we mean by all this? Shallow processing means you're looking at very superficial physical and perceptual features. So if I said, is the word G in the word encoding, you have to kind of scan through and go E-N-C-O all the way to G, and then you hit G and say yes. If later I asked you, what did I ask you, what word had a G in it, you might not remember because you only process it very shallowly. You weren't really looking at it in much detail. Intermediate processing, you recognize and label something, like we say that, oh, the thing that you're looking at is a car, for instance. And in deep processing, you're doing something very meaningful, connecting something that you're trying to learn to what you already know. So if I asked you to memorize something like principles of classical conditioning, the best way to learn it is to say, one time I went out and drank a whole lot of tequila. And I got sick and I vomited, and after that I never wanted to drink tequila again. Just thinking about it, smelling it, looking at it, it just makes me feel nauseous and I will not drink it. Let's say that you identified a taste aversion example for yourself and then you labeled everything. So the CS being the smell or the sight of the tequila, the US being the whatever it did to your stomach to make you sick, and the unconditioned response, getting sick, and now the conditioned response is feeling nauseous and avoiding tequila. If you're trying to learn something like that, the best way to learn those concepts is to connect it to something you already know, a unique example that is only yours. And it's sort of like if you've ever watched an old Western movie where a cowboy rides into town on his horse and he goes into the saloon. And right before he goes into the saloon, he slings the horse's reins over a hitching post. Why does he do that? Well, when he comes back out for his horse, he wants to make sure the horse is still there. So he attaches it to something to be sure the horse will be waiting for him. Your memory works the same way. If you want to remember something that you're learning for a class, you need to tie it to a hitching post. That is, connect it to something that you already know, a personal example, something in your life that it reminds you of, or a person, for instance. So long-term memory comes in several different forms, including explicit memory, which are things that the word explicit means that you can kind of say it out loud. These are things that if I asked you about this information, you'd be able to tell me. Your implicit memory is stuff that you can't necessarily describe out loud. As an example, your procedural memory, like how you drive a car, you just get into the car and you do it. You know how to do it. if I asked you to say step by step so that somebody from another planet would be able to drive a car, I bet your verbal description wouldn't help them very much. They need to get into the car and learn for themselves. So this involves things like learning to ride a bike or play a musical instrument. It also includes in your implicit memory are priming. That's things like if I started talking to you about oceans and lakes and so on, I have primed you so that when I talk to you about a bank, you are thinking of a surface just above some water rather than an institution where you would go get your money. So priming is an example of implicit memory, and so is classical conditioning. Your explicit memory or declarative memory includes the episodes from your life, the events that you've experienced. So if you remember what you did when you turned 16 or what you did last weekend, that information is coming out of your episodic memory. And your semantic memory is all of your knowledge. It's kind of the factual stuff that you know. So if I asked, who was the very first president of the United States? The answer will be retrieved from your semantic memory. Now, all of these different memory systems are sort of represented differently in the brain. So if you remember Clive Waring from the chapter on biological psychology, who had difficulty remembering from moment to moment, you might remember that he doesn't have his episodic memory. That is, he doesn't remember when he got married or what his wife wore or who came to the wedding. He couldn't tell you who the various presidents were, but he did kind of remember his wife and his love for her. And he was also able to still conduct and play music. So his implicit memory was intact. So that implies that this is not based on the hippocampus, whereas this information is. So how is our semantic memory organized? Your semantic network, all of the facts that you know are connected to each other. So that if I ask you to think of the word animal, think of this as a node, this little oval that says animal. And it is connected to things that are related to it, like all the different kinds of animals, tigers or cats or dogs. And cats are connected to concepts like pets, and so are canaries. And canaries are connected to your concept of yellow. So everything in your semantic memory is in some way connected to just about everything else. So if I ask you to think about an animal, what happens is that the node, think of it as lighting up when you're thinking of the concept animal. And that as it lights up, it spreads activation to related nodes like dog or bird, or has skin for the animals that have skin. And that the further away you are from the concept of animal, so green is pretty far away from animal. When you think of animal, not much activation spreads to green, but a lot spreads to tiger, let's say. So spreading activation is this process by which activation of one concept primes concepts that are linked to it in this interconnected network of facts. Now, let's imagine that I listed off a bunch of words to you, like bed, slumber, rest, comfort. And imagine the list was quite lengthy and had 25 or 30 words in it. And then later I asked you, hey, remember that list I read to you about an hour ago? Was the word sleep in that list? You'd probably say yes. And the reason is that I said all of these things that were related to sleep, like comfort or bed or rest. And as I said each of those, activation spread to the concept of sleep. So even though I wouldn't have said the word sleep, you might think that I did, just because of all that spreading activation. another example here is the idea of the tip of the tongue phenomenon. You know that musical instrument, it begins, well, I won't tell you yet because I want to create a tip of the tongue phenomenon. So it's a musical instrument that consists of a series of metal bars that you hit with a wooden mallet. You might have had one when you were a kid. If you kind of know what I'm talking about, but you can't remember what it's called, then I've created the tip of the tongue phenomenon in you. And I could probably help relieve that by saying it begins with the letter X. If you're then able to say, oh yeah, it's a xylophone, then I have just triggered that tip of the tongue phenomenon and maybe just relieved it for you. So as I said, a musical instrument and a series of bars and so on, activation spread over to xylophone, but maybe it was so far away that not enough activation spread. When I added one more retrieval cue, that is, it begins with the letter X, that might have tipped the scales so that we got enough activation spread to the concept xylophone. So this is why we need to attach concepts to a hitching post, because you create retrieval cues that you can use later to help you find information that you're having trouble remembering. So how well do we remember information over time? The famous psychologist Ebbinghaus conducted the very first studies on long-term memory, and he did so by studying nonsense syllables. These were consonant-vowel combinations that did not spell a real word, like TJR, JKL, or something like that. He memorized these nonsense syllables and then tested his memory for them over time. And he did all these on himself. So this chart shows the percentage of the original vocabulary retained. So if he got 100% when testing himself, he would score here. If he remembered nothing, it would be down here. And then he looked at what happened over time. And what you can see is most of what you're going to forget, you forget early. So this drop is very steep. And if you really analyze, this is 1 year, but the biggest drop down to close to 50% happens in the first hour after you have learned information. An hour later, most of what you were going to forget is forgotten. And then it's a more subtle, gradual decrease over time. So 50 years later, you don't remember very much. But the biggest drop is early on. So obviously, most of us aren't worried about nonsense syllables. We're worried about real information we need to remember for various tests or for work, let's say. So in studies where they've looked at people memorizing real stuff like Spanish, let's say you took a Spanish course and we wanted to test how well you retained what you learned in Spanish, then we would have to look over time and we would get the same curve that Ebbinghaus got. That is, most of what you're going to forget. Another factor that influences our ability to retrieve information from long-term memory is known as the serial position effect. It's the tendency to remember the first and the last items in a series better than the items in the middle. There's really two specific terms for the specific effects at either end. The primacy effect is a tendency to remember the first items in a list, and the recency effect is a tendency to remember the last items in a list very well. As an example, if you go to a concert and you hear 20 songs, you're most likely to remember what the band opened with or what it did as an encore than what it did halfway through. Or if you meet 15 people at a party, you will probably remember the first couple people you met and the last person that you met. These are examples of the serial position effect. In research, it's measured by looking at the percentage of correct recall of a particular list as a function of the item's position in the series. Recall is about 90% or better for the first and the last item, and the closer you get to the middle from either direction, the more poor the memory is for information in those lists. Something else that influences your ability to retrieve information is the context in which you learned the information. And there's two kinds of context. There's the surrounding environment all around you. Like right now you're listening to a lecture and you're sitting somewhere where there are things that you can look around and see. That's the context. And where you're sitting right now is a potential retrieval cue later. So if you're sitting in the same place that you're going to be taking your test later for this class, then you're creating a contextual cue that will help you recall information. The study presented in the chart over on the right shows an actual experiment that looked at context-dependent memory for scuba divers who had to learn word lists while underwater or on land. Now, we usually don't do any studying when we're underwater, but in this case, it was a little bit of a crazy experiment where they tested them in the same or a different context as they studied. So the first bar shows you when they studied on land and took the test on land. The second bar, they studied underwater, took the test underwater. And the third bar is when they studied on land and got tested underwater. And the fourth, they tested or studied on underwater and then got tested on land. And you can see that memory was better. There was close to, 35 on average percent better for retention of the information from the same context as opposed to the different context. Now, the reason land was probably the best is that that's where we do most of our studying. Very few of us scuba dive and take our textbooks with us. So the context in which you learn will influence your retrieval later. There's also a state-dependent effect. That's your internal state. It could be psychological, pharmacological, or it could relate to the time of day. So if you study at night and take tests in classes during the morning, you're changing your mental state. And anytime you change your mental state between studying and taking a test, you hamper your ability to remember. So if you generally are studying late at night with a cup of coffee and you're taking the test sitting in class without any coffee, then you have changed your pharmacological or psychological state, and that can influence retrieval. Another factor that influences our ability to remember is interference. Interference is when one memory gets in the way of another memory. And there's two types. In the first example, which is retroactive interference, something that you're currently studying goes back and messes up what you learned beforehand. Now, in this case, they're showing two things that are very similar, psychology and sociology. So if the idea is that you study for a psychology test and then you study for your sociology test afterwards, that what you learned about sociology might go back and interfere with what you learned about psychology. Now, one example that I've experienced through a friend of mine, I took French all through high school and even for about a year in college. And when I got to my college French class, I had a friend that had taken Spanish in high school. His first language was English, but he took Spanish while he was in high school, and in college he decided to try taking French. And he spoke what I used to call Sprench, because the professor would say, "Bonjour, comment ça va aujourd'hui?" And he would answer, "Bonjour, señorita," and something like that, where what he was now learning from French was messing up the stuff that he had learned from Spanish. And it was sort of getting confusing, but it was also quite comical. So proactive interference is the opposite direction, when the stuff you learned before interferes with the stuff you learn today. Now, depending on how many times in your life you get in and out of a relationship or a friendship, you might experience this type of interference where you say to your friend, remember that time that we went to the beach and X, Y, and Z happened? And then to your horror, you realize that that happened in a different relationship or with a different friend. So what we are experiencing today can go back and interfere with what we learned in the past, and stuff that we learned in the past can also interfere in today's learning. So retroactive meaning going back, and proactive meaning going forward. So if somebody says, I forgot, in terms of actual memory loss, how do we lose information? This is kind of a summary of things that we talked about. One is the encoding failure. The information wasn't attended to, so it never got into your long-term memory. Another is consolidation failure. The information got into your memory, but you did not use elaborative rehearsal. You looked at the information in a superficial or shallow processing manner. And so the item was never consolidated or formed into a long-term memory. Sometimes memories decay over time. This is most true for sensory and short-term memory, and less true for long-term memory. Interference is when other memories get in the way. Amnesia is really when you have organic damage to your brain because you've hit your head or you've had some sort of trauma, medical condition or something like that. And a retrieval failure is when the information is in your long-term memory, but you can't bring it to mind because you didn't connect the information well enough to that hitching post in your semantic network. So hopefully this gives you some idea of how your memory system works so that you can possibly study better in the future. That's all for today.